Unbelievable Swamp Secrets 4. Real creepy stories you never knew. Beneath the surface of a place like the Big Cypress, the world keeps its own ledger. Things sink there and stay. Secrets, trash, the occasional truth that nobody asked for. I grew up near wetlands and later worked in them. I learned how to read mud the way other people read a clock. I can tell when the airboat's wake is wrong, when the hush before a thunderstorm means more than rain, and how the swamp smells when it's hiding something alive or already gone. People come to swamps to fish, to run, to hide. They leave parts of themselves behind. Before we go any further, a quick warning. Some of what follows includes traumatic content and descriptions of found human remains. I will be respectful and restrained in how I tell those parts, but if that could be distressing for you, consider listening later. This is an anthology of 4 stories, all set in marsh and mire. Each one real in the sense that someone told it, someone investigated it, someone couldn't let it go. The swamp is a character in every case, patient, indifferent, and disturbingly efficient at swallowing things whole. The first story is mine, and it begins with a routine sampling trip at dawn and a small, terrible discovery that rewrote everything I thought I knew about what fieldwork brings you. I called her Annie then. At the time, she was the senior wetlands ecologist on a small grant to map invertebrate diversity across a stretch of Big Cypress. Annie had long hair she tucked under a cap, a battered field vest full of labels and pens, and a practical sort of calm you see in people who spend more time with insects than with phone screens. She could read a pH strip the way some people read poetry. She carried a ponar, a kind of sediment grab with teeth like a wide metal clam, strapped to the back of an airboat. If you work in wetlands, you learn the tools and the terminology. A ponar is a blunt instrument for telling you what the bottom is made of. It brings up mud, detritus, worms, things that tell a story about water quality and history. It doesn't usually bring you storybook images. The morning was thick in that way only a Florida dawn gets. Humidity like a sea someone had left open, a light that felt more viscous than air, and the smell of rot living alongside green growth, peat, decaying cypress knees, the sour, sweet hint of vegetation giving back what it took. We were sampling a transect that cut across a narrower channel, the kind of place where the banks pinch in and the water darkens until you can't see an inch below the surface. Mosquitoes found us in clouds even before the light fully kindled. Annie's logbook shows times, GPS points, salinity measures. It reads like a map of small, careful decisions. Routine, then. She and her field tech motored in, anchored briefly to check instruments, dropped the ponar where they'd often dropped it before and winched it up. The jar that collects the sediment doesn't usually hold anything that reacts. Sometimes a minnow will look out and blink. That morning, the ponar came up sticky, heavier than mud should be. What Annie told me, and I have her recollection written in her own handwriting, which she lent me to quote from, was this. The ponar opened on the deck, and there was a shape. Not a neat shape, not like a doll or a thing left on purpose, but a smallness collapsed into itself. Her words were careful about anatomy and kind in their horror. It wasn't a body we could recognize. It looked smaller. The skin had darkened. There was hair in clumps, and a weight that didn't belong to mud. She vomited on the deck. She gagged and steadied herself against the airboat's railing. She called it in, an exact phrase to dispatch, and a number for missing persons. And then one of the most ordinary, most recognizably human things happened. She panicked. Panic in fieldwork doesn't come out like in movies. It is a practical panic. What to bag, how to stop cross-contamination, how to note the coordinates before the water reclaims the evidence. She wrapped the find in one of their spare sampling gloves, put it on ice in a cooler with a note, and made the call. There was no theater in that moment, only the electric, precise care of someone trying to honor the dead as a person rather than as a data point. The detective who took the call was based in Everglades City, a small team used to irregular calls and seasonal oddities. He drove out in dusty shoes and a worn cap, the kind of fallible hero you see in small-town reporting, a man who knows how to move through swamp privacy and the bureaucracy that comes with it. The detective's notes are clipped. He recorded the coordinates, the time of collection, the fact that Annie's crew had gloves on and had kept the find on ice. The coroner came out and the body, if body is the right word, was packaged and transported to the county morgue. In a place like Florida, where the water is full of scavengers, decomposition takes on a choreography of its own. The coroner told Annie later that the remains were in an advanced state of decomposition. Soft tissues were largely gone or sloughed, and what remained could not be matched to a missing person in any easy way. There are technical reasons this happens. Swamps are warm, moist, and oxygen-poor in the same breath. Microbes thrive, insects do their work, and the chemical mixture of tannins and acids in the water can turn what was once flesh into something dark and indistinct faster than you expect. A body in a pond can be stripped of recognizable features in weeks under the right conditions. That doesn't make the discovery any less wrenching. It makes it more so. The not-knowing layered over the certain small physical knowledge that someone was once alive, and then they were not. The official file names the remains as John Jane Doe. The staff tried to extract DNA. The sample was insufficient for a reliable match. There were no missing person reports that matched the description in cystic ways. No child's picture lingering on a missing poster that said, "This could be them." The hours of cross-referencing, the calls to child protection agencies, the outreach to neighboring counties, those are the routines of grief and procedure. They found nothing conclusive. The case went cold in the bureaucratic sense. No suspects, no identifications, no neat closure. But the emotional aftershock persisted. Annie told me she slept badly for months after. She would wake in the small hours with the taste of swamp in her mouth or with the sensation that something was watching from the cattails. There were nights she drove out to the coordinates and stood in the dark until the airboat engine coughed and her breath fogged. She replayed the call to the detective in her head, listening for some different phrase that might have changed everything. She shouldered a private, heavy guilt. She had not done anything wrong. There was no should have that logically kept her from calling it in immediately. Still, the human mind seeks aberration in its own choices, as if that could resurrect what was lost. In the weeks after, people in a nearby town whispered. The loudest whispers were practical. Researchers should be careful. Fieldwork is dangerous. But there were also darker rumors. Rumors about trafficking. Rumors that the child was not of any local household. Rumors that the water takes children, in the way old wives' tales insist. The detective, as I said, is a fallible human being with a docket. He filed the report and did what he could. Investigators ran the limited forensic avenues they had. The medical examiner wrote an entry, and then the entry grew thin with time. Evidence that could have led to a match had degraded beyond action. Technology sometimes fails at the things human grief asks of it. We have in anthropology and in forensics words for this: a cold case, unidentified remains, no match. Those terms are clinical. The real life under them is not. Annie carried the memory like a weight. She quit the grant after a season and transferred to a habitat restoration post 2 counties over. It wasn't escape so much as rearrangement. She still worked in wetlands, but she chose places where the smell of peat didn't hollow her out. She missed the data in a way she could name. No one else becomes as particular about a ponar as she did. The memory followed her into meetings and field trainings. When she did sleep, the dreams were 3-part sequences: water rising, hands reaching, a child that was both familiar and not. The town responded with ritualized sympathy. There was a small ceremony, the sort of thing counties do when an unidentified person is found, a respectful burial paid by county funds, a headstone that read simply, "Unidentified child," a date. The cemetery volunteer who dug the grave later told me how she felt the soil press like a palm to a closed face. People left small toys and shells, but grief in public wears thin. For the agencies involved, cases that can't be actively pursued eventually go dark to make room for the living, who can still be helped. There are, of course, possible explanations that never passed from possibility into proof. Some locals suggested the child might have been a runaway from a nearby trailer park, someone lost and claimed by quick water and quick rot. Others wondered about human trafficking routes that skirt the edges of marshes, places of transit that look like natural borders. The detective told me he considered every plausible lead, from the mundane to the cruel, but had no probable cause to pursue any person with vigor. The coroner's report allowed for an open verdict. Death by undetermined causes with body recovered from water. Unresolved is the word the file settles on, the one that both comforts and insults. Comforts because it doesn't close the door on possibilities. Insults because it refuses to give names to the nameless. One detail I never wanted to dwell on but must. Annie's sampling protocol saved us from contaminating what remained. She had the presence of mind to keep the material on ice and to note the GPS coordinates. It meant that, had the DNA been viable, the chain of custody would have validated the sample. That it was not viable is a failure of biology, not of procedure. But that sort of technical specificity does nothing to ease the ache of not knowing. I spent time with Annie after it all. We went through the blue notebooks and the log entries, and the calls answered in the hours between dawn and when the lab could open. She taught me how to recognize early-stage decomposition in waterlogged environments without showing me images that would sear memory. She showed me the ponar, a dull, fat thing with a hinge, and explained what it did. When you pull it, she said, you're asking the bottom to tell you its story. Mud has patience. People do not. She said it without melodrama, with a professional's low exasperation, but she also said something softer. I keep thinking about who's coming to look for them now. We ate breakfast, we went to the site. Where were they? The local paper ran a small article, 3 paragraphs wedged between a high school sports recap and a county commission announcement. Nothing viral, no national outrage. The story didn't fit the frame that draws attention. An unsolved child's death in a swamp is not a headline that mobilizes mass grief easily, perhaps because it's too many things at once. A tragedy, a bureaucratic impasse, and a mirror for how the living feel about being ineffective. People in the town made offerings, a vigil light, a child's shoe on a stake by the road, a few dollars on a church counter. The detective kept the file active in his mind, a slow-burning ember of duty. What haunted Annie most wasn't the public absence of closure. It was the intimate, minute memories that attached themselves to the day. The way the airboat's engine coughed as it started, the sound her tech made when she saw the sample, the way the sun cut the water in a particular way that morning. Memory, for witnesses, is less about the large outline and more about the small, tactile things that attach like burrs. She would tell the story the way a person tells a wound, by making small protective gestures, shifting the narrative to procedure, to the ponar, so she didn't have to sit too long in the space where she had learned that a child had been lost and unnamed. I asked the detective if he'd ever gotten a break. He shrugged in a way that carried the heavy, grey air of someone who had become practiced in disappointment. We check DNAs when we can. We check databases, missing kids reports. Sometimes something pops up. Some kin sends in a family match request from some other state. But with water decomposed the way it was, there's not always DNA to pull. His voice had the soft official cadence of someone who must express empathy, but cannot promise miracles. We did announce the find to partner agencies. We asked the public for tips. Nothing came. And here's the trick the swamp teaches you. Time doesn't heal stubborn mysteries, it buries them. It makes them part of the landscape. The spot where Annie pulled the ponar is now in her memory, a place you visit carefully, the way families treat an old wound. The coordinates are in an agency file, the headstone sits in a county plot, and people who pass by might see the toys and not know the story. The thing about memory is it wants to be kept alive. The thing about Marsh is it wants things to disappear. After that first season, Annie left the intensive sampling project. She didn't stop loving the wetlands. She didn't stop doing the careful work that makes conservation happen. She only stopped pretending ordinary fieldwork was purely academic. The swamp had shown her a moral dimension she could not unsee, that every sample could be a life. It intended her to carry a responsibility she hadn't bargained for. That responsibility is small and huge at once. It keeps you awake at night. It's worth pausing here to remind ourselves that in ecological fieldwork, protocols exist not just for data integrity, but for human decency. We bag, label, and record because those steps can help someone else. Another detective, a grieving family, an anthropologist decades hence, piece together fragments into a name. When those steps fail because of biological reality, we are left with fragments that are both scientific and sorrowful. If this kind of find and the stories that grow out of it interest you, stick around. There are more of these odd, real corners of the swamp to look into. If you're new here and you want more dark finds like this, hit subscribe. I bring these narrations twice a week. The swamp keeps turning at the edge of towns, but not all of its secrets are forensic. Some live in oral memory, in the stories families pass down because they are too strange to bear alone. The second story I learned by sitting on an old porch under a warped tin roof, listening to my grandfather tell of a wartime season when men went missing and the swamp answered in its own way. Grandpa used to start those stories by saying, "You listen to the water and the water listens back." He served in the war, or at least that's the shorthand he used. Grandpa's service was a kind of halo around him, a credibility that lubricated the telling of other things. He worked as a trapper and odd-job guy in Madison County for most of his life and kept an uncomfortable familiarity with military records and rumor. After the war, a POW camp was set up in the region, something the federal files confirm. Temporary camps during the war, often holding German prisoners of war who were employed on local farms and road crews. In that environment, tensions were high and the rules were loose, the kind of mixture that breeds rumor. Grandpa's version begins in 1944, or maybe 1943. He wasn't exact about years, and that's one reason I mark timelines as reported in pieces like this. He'd come home from his shift and hear neighbors whisper about men in uniform walking the margins at night, about a boat disappearing on a sworn-in look, about the swamp making strange echoes at dusk. Official histories note that wartime camps and the Office of War Information kept a lid on certain local incidents so as not to damage morale. That kind of censorship is a fact. The federal government sometimes quietly managed what could reach the papers. What that creates on the ground is a memory landscape made of half words and gestures. The rumors took shape. Some said 3 German prisoners escaped and simply melted into the marsh as if the swamp had swallowed them whole. Others swore they'd seen apparitions, shadow figures by the tree line, faces at the edge of fog, after midnight. These were the kinds of rumors that feed on themselves. In towns where mills close early and the lights go off, people invent patterns to hold fear at bay. In many cases, those patterns never explain anything. Then there's George Jackson, a local teenager who vanished the summer after those rumors sharpened into something like a community panic. George was 15. Everyone's version agreed on that, and he delivered gas and groceries on a bike through the country roads. One day he didn't come home. The searches were immediate and frantic. Neighbors, farmers, a few soldiers who could be spared. They combed the banks, peered into sinkholes, and followed deer paths into cypress stands. After a week, a trapper, his name is recorded in a county ledger as Eli, though locals sometimes call him by other names, found something in a drainage channel. A scrap of clothing, a shoe. Later, according to Grandpa, murmurings of a shirt being found near a gator trap came through like a small, terrible rumor that turned the town's whisper into a steady dawn hum. Then the more extraordinary claims arrive in the telling. A trapper would later gut a gator and pull out improbably a piece of a uniform, striped fabric that could have been a remnant of a German coat. That detail is, in official files, recorded as possible uniform fabric found in a gator. It's one of those small factual entries that expands into a myth. Was it a uniform remnant or something similar? We record it as reported. It fueled speculation that German prisoners had been dragged into the water, eaten by both men and beast, that George had been on a collision path with some larger, darker plot. None of the official entries named perpetrators or confirmed motives. The file again grows thin. One or in other tellings, Wayan, the local pronunciation slides between versions, so I mark the name as indefinido in the notes, was a gator hunter with a reputation for fair weather luck. He had a southern twang and a scar on his forearm that made people listen. According to Grandpa's telling, Juan answered a night call, a cry that sounded like a woman in distress carrying over the reeds. He and a companion followed the noise into a thick section of swamp where moonlight barely reached, and where fog clung low to the water like a living thing. They found signs of a struggle, the broken stems of rushes, and then a figure, bruised, naked, and very young. Grandpa always lowered his voice when he said George's name. The air at the edge of his porch hung with mosquitoes, and you could feel the townspeople's sympathy pressing at the edges of the conversation like an uninvited guest. What Juan reported next was the kind of thing that splits a small place into factions. As he tried to help the boy, he said 3 men appeared from the dark, pale, silent, their faces smeared with a chalk-like paste. They moved without announcing themselves. They attacked. Grandparents like mine use the word attack in a way that makes you imagine a brawl. Juan used it to mean something more ritual, an assault that felt less about theft than about certain kinds of show. Juan fought. He survived with wounds he carried the rest of his life. Later, 3 men were found, their bodies, if body is the fitting word, covered in that same chalk paste, dead in the marsh. The coroner's notes recorded a cause of death, and then the pages stopped being public. There are problems with that narrative. Bodies in the marsh rot in ways that confuse identification. A man may die in a ditch of exposure or in a drunken fall. The circumstances get wrapped in rumor. The chalk paste detail is intriguing and remains unexplained in public records. Local accounts insist the paste was used as ritual camouflage, the sort of explanation that sounds less like criminality and more like a primitive, theatrical performance. Whether the paste had symbolic meaning, practical application, or was merely a smear from some other source is a question that remains, again, unresolved in the archival sense. The town's official response was muted. During wartime, officials were cautious about broadcasting chaos. No one wanted to elevate panic. Soldiers were moved away. The camp tightened restrictions, and reporting to national papers was sparse. For locals, this silence felt like betrayal. For officials, it felt like necessary containment. In the absence of clear communication, rumor becomes a way to fill the hole. Grandpa's telling of Juan's fight always had an edge of moral ambiguity. The men who attacked were found dead. Their identities were not neatly discovered. Some people in town thought they had been enemy saboteurs, others thought they were local vigilantes in disguise, and a few suggested less savory connections to black market dealings that the war made profitable. The deeper pattern I noticed when I cross-referenced Grandpa's memories with county archives was a consistent motif. During wartime, local social orders fray. Men in uniform and men out of uniform rub shoulders with a rough economy, and small institutions, courts, papers, neighbors, strain under the weight. In those years, a missing teen could easily slip from urgent to forgotten in the bureaucratic nether. If a body is found with no easy identifying marks, the legal machinery needs leads, names, family, dental records that simply may not exist in rural pockets. Meanwhile, the survivors carry the story forward in the only thing they have left: tale. Grandpa's account, like all oral histories, carried texture you won't find in a formal file. The way the swamp smelled that night, the hush of the air, the individual timbers creaking on a house porch. He described, in one vignette he insisted on repeating, the way Juan's hands trembled when he threw down his cigarette that night afterward, not because of the cigarette itself, but because everything had become a notch under the skin. Those human details build the sort of cumulative pressure that makes rumor feel like evidence. I want to be clear. Not every part of Grandpa's story is provable. The federal files show nothing like a formal cover-up. They do, however, show gaps consistent with wartime censorship and the often limited reach of county law enforcement. I do not present the chalk-painted attackers as fact any more than I present the German uniform piece in a gaiter as proof. I present them as elements of local memory and as credible reports that shaped a community's fear. Memory and file can diverge without one winning. Both tell us something. What they collectively do, whether through bureaucratic lacunae or through the amplification of oral tradition, is produce a terror that is not about the supernatural so much as about the unknown in your neighbor's behavior. When men vanish into reeds and silence after a season of hostilities, the town's imagination fills in motives so it can sleep again. We stop there because the next stretches outward. The way the town adjusted, how soldiers were reassigned, what happened to families who lost sons, and how those events knit into later stories about the swamp's appetite for vanished things. The swamp doesn't care whether the story is about wartime escape or a child's death in a ponar. It takes all of it and responds in the same way, by keeping. From here, the map of stories bends toward another edge of human violence, this time a century earlier, soaked in moonshine and vigilante justice. But before I tell that one, I want to underscore what these narratives share. The swamp is a limit. It is where law, memory, and nature meet and very often fail to reconcile. It models the moral problem of how a community contains trauma, through burial, through rumor, through forgetting. Each mechanism is messy. We move next to the bayou, to a different kind of lawlessness, to beaded glass and the smell of fermenting corn, to a man who became both guardian and judge. The story there complicates the notion of justice and leaves the moral ledger smudged and hard to read. The third story bends the map of the swamp into a different shape, less about unknown corpses and wartime rumors, more about lawlessness dressed as law, and about a man who decided the only justice that mattered was his own. My great-grandmother, Velma, told this one with a voice that made every syllable feel like a glass bead passed along a string. She called it, "The Night the Law Left the Road and Walked into the Marsh," and she said it out of a habit of telling the settlement's worst moments so they could be carried together instead of alone. A quick note before I go further. This next section contains accounts of violent revenge and descriptions of bodies found in the water. I will keep the language measured and respectful. If that is something you'd prefer to skip, consider taking a break now. Prohibition, its federal banners flying from 1920 to 1933, did something to places like the bayou that maps and high-minded laws never could predict. On paper, the country stopped selling spirits. In practice, the demand moved production into barns, shuttered kitchens, and hard-to-patrol Cypress backwaters. Louisiana, with its braided waterways and informal economies, became a natural corridor for stills and the people who ran them. Families threaded moonshine into the pulse of daily life. A barrel of corn liquor could fund a roof, grease a favor, or feed a parish of hungry mouths through winter lean times. Great-Grandma Velma's telling situated the drama in what locals called Playman's Parish, indefinido in some records and pronunciation. It was the kind of place where parish lines mattered as much as fences, and where a police chief's word could bend the law. Chief Henry Herbert, people remembered him as no mere officer but as an authority who read the code of the bayou as if it were written in water, ran his beat with a blunt, old-world certainty. He had a jaw like split oak, and eyes that seemed to measure men by how much moonshine they hid in their hollows. This is not to say that the 1920s were monolithically violent. Many nights the parish hummed with routine, church suppers, children running sticky-footed from stoop to stoop, the low boom of an engine on Route 9. But there were the other nights, the ones Velma preserved with a clarity that made them feel immediate. Those were the nights when enforcement met profit, when informants and old grudges found a tinderbox, and when Chief Herbert felt the law could be improved with his own hands. Velma set up her story like a piece of slow theater. They started with a small thing, she would say. A deputy shot near a still, a man beaten on a levee, a rumor of a shipment meant for outsiders. The parish had seen crews of moonshiners who paid neighborhood kids in corn syrup and who slipped barrels into hidden channels under cover of fog. Herbert decided, whether out of duty, pride, personal vendetta, or some cocktail of all three, that this would end. He organized raids, yes, but he also organized something more ad hoc, squads that moved after dusk, men who knew the bayou as well as they knew their own kin. Into this picture steps Jacob, my great-grandfather, whose own story threads through the telling like a splinter. Jacob was a stocky man, with a farmer's hands, and a temper that matched a spring storm, quick to flare, quick to pass. He had survived a near-fatal ambush in the years before the big backlash. He carried, in family stories, the memory of a night when shot had ricocheted through a cabin wall, and his brother had not. That ambush made him suspicious of both strangers and the steady pressure of outside forces on a small community's resources. Velma used to say Jacob was there because every town needs someone who's been bent but keeps standing. He was present when Chief Herbert and his men began to enforce what they claimed was justice. They burned stills with an almost ceremonial fury, flames eating copper and sugar, lighting the night with a sound like paper tearing. They dragged barrels from shallow coves and smashed them where they stood. Sometimes they returned with prisoners, men bound, eyes wide, who later were led out past the road and quietly handed over to larger authorities. People told differing stories about what happened next. Then the event that Velma never stopped retelling, the killing that turned law into a vendetta. A parish officer, one of Herbert's, was murdered while attempting to break up a fight near a still. The account in local court records is skeletal. Names appear and then vanish from pages. But Velma's version had the kind of human detail the dry file lacked. The officer, popular with neighbors, had been fishing that afternoon. The paper reported he was on routine patrol. And that night, someone shot him in the back near a levee, where the cicadas parked like loose music. The town mourned him as if they'd lost a brother. Then, according to Velma, came what she framed as the collapse. An informant girl's abduction, and a discovery so foul that it hardened grief into fury. The girl, some records call her a lookout, others an errand girl, was found with her lungs described by neighbors in the oral retelling as drunk with moonshine. Let me be clear, the phrase is Velma's and the image is hers to bear in memory. County inquests skirted the phrasing. The official entry notes a murder and a body recovered. Family accounts add the detail that the girl's body smelled strongly of ferment, that she had likely been forced to drink before her death. It is horrifying to recount, and the point of including it is not prurience but context. In an economy where liquor financed crimes and friendships alike, the boundary between victim and commodity blurred in catastrophic ways. When that discovery came, Chief Herbert crossed from enforcement into retribution. If the law was slow or compromised, he reasoned, then he would perform the court's job himself. He assembled men, some deputized on the spot, some volunteers purporting to help, and they began a campaign of vigilante justice. Ambushes followed, roads cut at night, boats lurking in channels, stills set alight as warnings. Men accused of sheltering contraband were dragged out into the mud and shot, according to a host of recollections. Bodies were found in sloughs, faces turned to the sky, or they simply stopped arriving at funerals. Velma spoke of the village becoming quieter, the kind of quiet that arrives when people lock doors and the shadows feel like witnesses. Velma and Jacob's family lived through one of those nights. Jacob went out to the levee to see what the noise was. He came back with a story about a convoy of chief's men moving like a procession of iron, torches cutting the fog. Later, someone's cousin disappeared. A neighbor's son never returned from a short trip to a neighboring parish. These things stacked together until grief became accusation. People began to ask if Herbert was hunting bootleggers or settling scores. Was he protecting the peace or preying on profit? The answer is not simple. Politics and informal economies strain moral categories. Herbert's campaign did reduce visible moonshine. Stills were destroyed, smugglers retreated, and the official record could, if you chose only certain entries, read like a successful crackdown on crime. But in the ledger of human lives, there were margins of loss. Men who shouldered suspicion for reputations earned decades prior, families who could not identify bones washed into unexpected coves, neighbors who lost the trust that made community governance possible. Velma's voice warmed and cooled as she told it. She defended that, for some in the parish, Herbert was a hero, a man with a sense of order who cut through corruption with a personal brutality he believed necessary. If you could go sleep at night because someone hid there still, you might call him a hero, she'd say. If your boy didn't come home because they thought he kept a bottle, you'd call him a butcher. The ambiguity sat like heat over a table. No one drank from it easily. There are a few specific moments historians and family stories both recall. One was the discovery of the chief's own private wound. His wife and daughter found murdered, their bodies dumped in a shallow marsh, and, in the family retelling, their lungs distended with fermented liquor. The county file references a tragic double homicide and notes signs of forced ingestion in a coroner's line. It stops short of vivid language. Velma's version used the fermented lungs image because it expressed a collective sense of perversion. The thing that nourished the parish also, in this telling, destroyed it when used as weapon and indictment. For Herbert, that personal blow apparently loosened any remaining legal restraint. What followed was a counter-escalation that some remember as justice and others as cruelty. Herbert's men were found at times with blood on their boots, at times not found at all. Families stopped going to market together. Jacob, who survived an ambush earlier, survived this season too, but with a shell that never fully closed. The ambush had taken his neighbor and a cousin, and it settled over him like an ache. He watched as the chief and his men drove further from formal law and closer to the kind of personal vendetta that leaves towns with fewer names to call each other by. Velma insisted on something else, that not every victim belonged to the marginal economy of liquor. Some who were targeted had grudges unrelated to moonshine, land disputes, unpaid debts, old family beefs. The paranoia of the moment twisted enforcement into excuse. Whether Herbert believed he was protecting the parish or proving a point, the result was the same. A community's moral fabric frayed. Eventually Herbert vanished, which is the kind of closure that leaves questions instead of answers. One night his boat was found beached, its lantern guttered, and the trail ran cold. Theories proliferated. He'd been murdered by the same black-souled men he'd persecuted. He'd staged his escape and fled to cities where no one knew the names. Some said he simply got lost in the tangle, and the swamp took him. An idea which Velma treated with a civil, almost academic detachment. The parish breathed out in different ways, depending on what version you heard. More than one family claimed to have closed a chapter. More than one family said the chapter never ended because the pain continued in quiet forms. For a long time afterwards, people in the parish told stories about finding remains that bore evidence of someone having been forced to drink, or of bodies disposed of in the bayou, or of men who simply stopped coming to Sunday dinners. The official record remained messy. Lawsuits and indictments cropped up briefly, then withered. Some men were processed, some were not. Historians looking back see patterns that more or less fit the national trend. Prohibition created the conditions for informal militias, for local power grabs, for blurred jurisdictions where accountability found easy holes. In the parish's own memory, though, it was a wound you could walk around but not step over. One small archival insertion I found in an old county ledger might illustrate how the legal paper trail tries and often fails to match oral witness. It's a brief sheriff's note from 1926, typewritten, polite. Still destruction authorized, property forfeiture per statute. 3 individuals cited for disturbance. Nothing about bodies or the casualty numbers whispered in kitchen corners. It's both a record and a refusal, the way officialdom sometimes chooses to sanitize events to preserve something else, public order, insurance claims, or an image of governed civility. What sticks with me as a narrator who traces these threads is the ordinary aftermath, the way people learn to speak softly about the season, the way some families stopped mentioning Herbert at all, and the way other families built a shrine of grievance. Jacob kept working, his hands in the dirt, but the work after the revenge took on a new edge, a habit of looking over one's shoulder, an even keener suspicion of outsiders. Ethically, these narratives caution us. They warn us about the costs of taking justice into private hands and about how easy it is to confuse righteousness with reaction. They show how disruptions, war, law, commerce, can tilt local mores into dangerous alignments. And they remind us of the human collateral, unnamed men found in swamps, families who carry a missing son's shadow into successive generations, and communities that stitch themselves back together with uneven thread. The bayou story ends without neatness. Chief Herbert disappears, so do some of the accused, and other accused men are arrested and released on technicalities. Velma's telling ends with a sentence I still hear in my head. We learned there's nothing clean under the reeds. It's not a conclusion so much as a register of sorrow, and in that sense it mirrors the earlier stories. The swamp keeps a ledger of things it thinks the living can forget. For some, the moral was to let the law do its slow work. For others, it was a grim lesson that revenge begets ruin. We need to move from that particular kind of ruin to a lighter, stranger kind of legend, the kind fishermen tell each other and keep alive because the practical world needs its stories to remain mysterious. It's the kind of tale that shifts energy down the line, from sanctioned violence to a creature that might bite back. The mood changes, the pace eases a bit, but the swamp's capacity for making the unbelievable feel possible remains. Earl was a man built in family memory for river work. He had calloused palms, a chest like a barrel, and a way of laughing that made people less inclined to argue. He told me his account years after the Herbert business had cooled to memory, and he told it between sips of coffee at a bait shop counter that smelled like fish and old oil. What made Earl's story stick wasn't only the wound he carried, but the way the town gave it shape. Half practical joke, half cautionary myth. The great dismal swamp in Earl's telling isn't the Florida cypress of the first story. It's more north, an older, darker kind of water that collects cold and holds it. The weather on the day he tells was lacquered with low clouds and a wind that made the reeds sound like a low, complaining instrument. Earl and a couple of friends were out for a quiet morning, trolling for largemouth and looking to pass the hours. They carried the standard: lines, bait, coolers, and more suspiciously, a couple of beers too many for a responsible outing. The little moment that detonated the tale was small and human. Earl says he leaned over the side of the boat, fumbling with a lighter, and one of the beers slipped from his hand and toppled into the dark water with an unassuming plop. He reached for it, then realized the bottle was too far. He held his breath and leaned further, and the world under the boat seemed to open a little. His boot slipped. He fell in, an undignified fall, and the shock of cold water grabbed him like a hand. When he told it, he laughed, and the laugh is still audible in my memory of the day. Fell in like a fool. Earl says what's next in the voice of a man who knows how to sell a fish tale. He felt something clamp on his calf, like a hand with teeth, he said, and something pulled. He fought because that's what men in those parts do. They fight the water, the current, the animal, the joke, whatever it is. He surfaced, spluttering and flailing, and saw for a blink a shape the size of a small boat vanish under the scum. When the other men hauled him into the boat and shone a light, there was a neat, raw strip on his calf, a crescent of rough skin, as if sandpaper had rubbed through. It wasn't a clean bite like from a shark. It felt as if something large and abrasive had scraped him. I checked with a regional fisherman at a later date about what might cause such a wound. He said catfish can cause deep wounds if something hooks and drags you, but most catfish bites are puncture marks from spines and not a sandpaper abrasion. Alligators leave proof in teeth. A snapping turtle leaves a kind of crescent too, but the size Earl described, wider than any snapping turtle in that marsh, didn't fit neatly. The ER note from the small hospital listed his diagnosis as laceration and contusion consistent with large aquatic animal, and treated him with stitches and an antibiotic. The physicians were practical. They didn't write monster in the margin. We must guard here against modern romanticizing. Fishermen always trade in tall tales and licenses to embellish. Earl's own retellings swelled slightly with each year in the telling, but there are archivable facts too. Earl did go to the ER. He did receive care. He did report his wound to other men at the docks. The local paper ran a short piece, "Local Fisherman Hurt in Swamp Incident." The piece presented the practical. Wound treated. Fisherman back home. The story around the docks began to inflame this into a different kind of lore. The idea of a giant catfish, gorged on decades of barns and bait, mutated into a singular aggressor. After Earl's injury, the cove became a pilgrimage site for some. Men came with nets, with homemade hooks, with bait that smelled of fermented corn and life. They came early and left late. There are a handful of photographs in circulation, grainy black and white images of men on rough boats holding lines over still water, grins compressed against dawn light. No photograph shows a monster. Someone caught a catfish that year larger than any they'd seen, big enough to make the claim plausible, though not the size implied by Earl's description. The fish was mounted and put on someone's porch, where it sagged in the heat like a relic. The wound healed as wounds do, and Earl bore a small pale crescent on his calf as a permanent souvenir. He joked about it at family reunions, the way men in those contexts joke to keep a kind of dignity in the face of the absurd. For some it was a neat modern monster story, the kind you tell to a new friend on a long fishing night and watch their eyebrows rise. For others it was proof that the swamp kept other ecologies, creatures that might grow more bold as the human and animal lines blurred with time. But Earl's story has a quiet tale. The frenzy to find a giant catfish leveled out. Men grew bored, the season changed, and the cove returned to its particular quiet cruelty. There are a few local additions. Someone later claimed to have snagged a fish with teeth-like structures once. A different man returned with a scar where the gills almost touched his forearm. But nothing definitive emerged. The legend stuck, though, and in a way that matters. It shifted the parish's story away from law and vengeance and back toward the animal world's inscrutability. It reminded people that the swamp's otherness isn't only human-made. What these 4 stories together ask is simple and complicated at once. What do we owe to each other? When the landscape conspires to hide facts, when institutions are slow or compromised, and when a person's body is reduced to an evidence bag. The swamp is more than a setting. It is an agent that both conceals and reflects. It shows us how communities respond, sometimes with care, sometimes with rumor, sometimes with violence, and how memory holds the shape of trauma long after the files grow thin. Pulling the threads together, some patterns emerge. First, secrecy thrives in places where movement is easy and oversight is thin. Whether it's the slow decomposition in Big Cypress that erased DNA, the wartime hush that let rumor grow in Madison County, Chief Herbert's lonely sense of authority in the bayou, or the fishermen's shared silence around their monsters, the swamp rewards opacity. Second, people tell stories to process what the legal system cannot. Velma and Grandpa preserved histories that the record didn't, not because they loved drama, but because lived experience needed a shape. Third, ambiguity is not the same as falsehood. These are real accounts, some verified, some partial, some suspect, that together form an archive of a place's moral life. For those who worked these edges professionally, detectives, coroners, biologists, the swamp demanded humility. Annie learned that the method was never just about data, it was about a responsibility to the dead. The detective in Everglades City learned to hold cases with a mixture of hope and practicality. Grandpa's wartime memories taught a community to be wary when federal silence coincides with local fear. Velma taught us that revenge questions the very idea of justice, and Earl taught us that the swamp sometimes answers with a bite you can physically mark. When I drive past the marsh now, I look for the small signs. Tires half sunken like a sleeping animal. A children's toy left like an offering. A rusting lantern hung on a fence post. These are the human traces that make the place legible in a way the water is not. The swamp keeps its ledger, but it also keeps the objects of grief and memory tucked like bookmarks. If you take any single thing from these 4 stories, let it be this. Reality in the swamp is not only about what happened, but about how a community remembers. The truth of an event lives not only in a coroner's notes, but in the way a mother refuses to let a missing child's picture fade, in the way men on a porch retell a fight until the edges of it are shaped by empathy, and in the way a wound on a fisherman's leg turns into a cautionary tale. I won't pretend to close these cases for you. The child in Big Cypress remains an unidentified grave, and a list of coordinates in a county file. The wartime vanishings in Madison County leave behind fragments in gator beds and tribunals of rumor. The prohibition vengeance in Playman's Parish, indefinido, resolves into a string of absent names and a vanished chief. Earl's bite remains a scar that proved one man's story and sparked a local myth. If these stories moved you, if you have a swamp memory of your own or a family tale that smells like wet earth and secrecy, I want to hear it. I read listener submissions. Send your recollections or tips to the email in the description. We treat them with care and respect, and we never present rumors as facts without corroboration. If you'd like to support this channel's work and help us dig into more of the country's hidden corners, you can find links to Patreon and membership options below. I post twice a week, and I try to balance the uncanny with careful reporting. Stories that honor the people involved and the complexity of the places where they lived. The swamp keeps its secrets, but it doesn't keep them to itself. It gives them up in small ways. A toy on a fence, a scar on a leg, an old woman's memory, a coroner's sideways note. They are not sensational headlines. They are quiet human wreckage and stubborn endurance. In the end, each story is an insistence that we pay attention, that we name what we can, and that we bear witness to what the land reveals. If this episode settled on you like a damp blanket, share it with someone who likes dark finds told with care. And if you were affected by anything in this episode, by grief, by memory, by the retelling of trauma, please take care of yourself after listening. Thanks for coming this far under the reeds. The swamp will keep turning, keeping its own records. We keep telling the stories, so those records don't get to decide what is remembered. If you want to hear more, the links below will take you to bonus materials, archival documents I referenced, and a way to support investigative episodes like this one. You can also send your swamp stories to the address in the description. I'll read them, and I promise to treat them with the same care I gave Annie, Grandpa, Velma, Jacob, and Earl. Until next time, keep your boots dry and your eyes open. The water remembers more than we'd like, and sometimes listening is the only justice we can offer.